Good morning and welcome to Bible Time at Sovereign Grace Community Church of the Yampa Valley. And as I look out my window this morning, it is snowing. Yesterday, it was almost 80 degrees here in Northwest Colorado, but today it's snowing and back in the lower 30s. So if you don't like the weather in Northwest Colorado, just wait a couple minutes and it'll probably change. Well, this morning we are continuing our look here at the second half of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 15 through 27. And this morning we're going to look at verses 16 through 18, and we're going to look at Paul's, he's kind of been giving these reasons, and you've seen Neo's tail behind me there, kind of been giving these reasons about that he's not manipulating them to get more reward or get more pay. He's not talking about that. And so this morning we're going to look at verses 16 through 18. So I just want you to follow along as I read 1 Corinthians 9:16. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Well, Paul, as we look at these verses here, he's talking about not losing his reward. And the reward was not for the message or the ministry of the gospel. Now, Paul, at times in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 31, he spoke of boasting in the Lord. In Romans chapter 15, verse 17, he said boasting in things pertaining to God. Even more often, though, the Apostle Paul spoke of rejoicing in the gospel, of glorifying in the cross, and supremely glorying in Jesus Christ. But he says here, if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. He gloried in the gospel, but not for the gospel. He had absolutely nothing, he understood, to do with the giving of or the content of the gospel. He simply had received the gospel by revelation from the Lord Jesus Christ. So he's not, nor is he boasting in his commitment to or his ability to preach the gospel. He did preach the gospel, as he says here, and probably more diligently than maybe anyone that we know of in the New Testament. But for this, he says, and this is interesting, he says he was under compulsion. And we know that the Lord stopped Paul on the road to Damascus when he was going by the name of Saul. He was on his way to Damascus to persecute the church, to persecute Christians there. At that time, Paul, at that moment, was set apart specifically for ministry to the Gentiles. And Paul chose God's call in the sense that he was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, as it says in Acts chapter 26. But he really had no choice. He says he was under compulsion. As Paul would realize later, God had set him apart, and he mentions this in Galatians 1:15. Paul mentions that God had set him apart from his mother's womb, not unlike Jeremiah, not unlike John the Baptist. Paul was called, he was ordained by God before he was ever born. And like Jeremiah, Paul could not refrain from preaching. Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9, at a time when he was very frustrated, very despondent because of the constant ridicule and rejection which he was experiencing, tried to stop preaching, but he could not. And he says in that verse, but if I say I will not remember him or speak anymore in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it. To the Colossians, Paul said in Colossians chapter 1, verse 25, Paul says, I was made a minister according to the stewardship from God bestowed on me. At some time or another, I think this is very normal for anybody that is a pastor, that is a preacher, that the Lord has called. They are going to realize that they are under God's compulsion. It is not that God's calling cannot be ignored, neglected, or slighted. It certainly can, but that it cannot and it does not change. The man who resists God's call or tries to give it up will, like Jeremiah, experience a burning fire shut up in their bones until he obeys. He has no choice. A few years ago, when we were in the midst of some of our travails at our last church, I had mentioned to my wife one evening, I think we were driving somewhere, and I said, maybe what I ought to do is just get another church job, another preaching job, and just go and do what the people want me to do. And my wife chuckled and she said, I don't think you could ever do that given your personality. Well, I don't know about my personality, but I know that I am under compulsion to preach the gospel. I can do nothing else. Now, added to that sense of constraint is a serious and a compelling responsibility, which Paul articulates here, and I think every pastor every faithful pastor can identify with, and that is, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. In effect, what Paul is saying is that the failure to obey that call would result in suffering serious chastisement. And James mentions this in James chapter 3, verse 1, that the most stringent judgment is promised for unfaithful ministers. Paul gladly preached the gospel, but he did not do it. And this is interesting. He says he did not do it voluntarily against my will, which he says here. That does not indicate that Paul was unwilling to obey, but that his will had no part in it, that had no part in the call itself. It was not Paul's choice to serve Christ. So consequently, he did not receive a reward, he says, but rather he received a stewardship. He was under obligation to preach, for which he neither deserved it nor did he expect any reward. And that should be our attitude as pastors. We should understand we don't deserve this call. We don't deserve this obligation. I often think that there has to be men much more qualified and much more talented than myself. And we do not expect a reward. It is a stewardship. That stewardship, that word, indicates that someone gives you something or some responsibility that they value very highly, and we are then to care for that responsibly and properly. And that is the case in every call to ministry. Paul gives the minister what he highly values for God gives the minister what he highly values, which is the gospel, for safe care, and promises us stern discipline if we are not faithful to that call. And Paul uses the interjection woe here to indicate impending pain if we are not faithful to that call. So we're going to continue this tomorrow as we move on. Tomorrow we'll look at verse 18 specifically, and we're going to look at the reward for preaching without charge. And so I want to thank you for joining me today. I pray that you've been blessed by this on a snowy day in Northwest Colorado. And I want to encourage you to share this far and wide if you have been blessed by it. Thank you, and have a blessed day.